Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Underneath. My name is Cale Zeldin. I wanted to talk to you today about a video I saw about a month ago featuring Bill Simmons and Chuck Klosterman as they attempted to make sense out of the election results that both of them were surprised by. Now, why do I care about this? Well, I care about this because Bill Simmons and Chuck Klosterman are kind of superstars, I would say, in the Gen X space. They are well respected in their industry, and both of them are uniquely Gen X and are uniquely respected, I would say, in the media uh, echo ecosphere. Right, both of them are a touch irreverent, a touch scruffy, but serious enough to be featured on major platforms and outlets, and that could be in major magazines, major websites, and of course the worldwide leader, ESPN. Bill Simmons is an interesting figure if you do not know about him. He was originally the Boston sports guy, and then became the sports guy and wrote I would say, a genuinely must-read column on page 2 of ESPN back in the day. And we're talking here in the early 2000s. And when I say must read, he was the kind of guy that he came out with a weekly column. And as soon as it came out, I would print it out. Yes, I printed it out and read it because it was going to be good. It was going to be funny. It was going to be informative. And it was going to be, most of all, it was going to be insightful. And this was true, with my friends and my brothers. As soon as it would come up, we would immediately talk about it. It was a serious thing, and really, Bill created quite a kind of style for himself. Grok will tell you that he has an innovative writing style. Has been deeply influential on media and sports media in particular. He created a number of different media ventures. He went from page 2. He went on to write his big book on basketball. He was an executive producer for ESPN's vaunted 30 for 30 and formed another website for ESPN called Grantland, which was unceremoniously taken away from him when he and the worldwide leader divorced unceremoniously in, I think, 2013 or 2014. His brand is really him. He is his brand. He writes from the vantage point of a sports fan, and he writes from a vantage point of a kind of certain sort of Gen X, not really caring so much about ceremony and being a little bit, authentic, I would say. That's how he skews. Now, his friend here, Chuck Klosterman, is similarly well respected amongst the media types. And both of these guys, it should be pointed out, these are the kind of guys those who work in mainstream media and press love these guys. They are very well respected for their work. And in part, they're loved because they get to do the kinds of things that the people who dress up and put on the makeup for news don't get to do. In fact, John Skipper, one of the guys who hired uh, Bill Simmons at ESPN, said, especially with Grantland, he wanted this venture to be like the Rolling Stone magazine was for the previous generation. So, if you know anything about Rolling Stone magazine, it was the sort of premier music and culture magazine of the 60s. If you It could make or break careers. It was seen as very important, but also it takes itself kind of seriously. And I think that is interesting to me when I read that little tidbit getting prepared for this video. Now, I should point out to you, this is not an exaggeration. This is the 6th time I've tried to make this reaction video. And it's a little frustrating to me. I've had technical difficulties. I've had days where it just didn't go well. I didn't feel like it flowed. And now I'm going to try again. One time I recorded a pretty decent version, but the audio was so bad because I didn't mute my microphone when I was playing the video that I'm going to show you. So that was a mess, and I really couldn't release that. And so then I just got finished doing one in which I did an entire introduction, but I forgot to unmute my microphone. So I'm going to try to do this well. I'm still a bit of a noob with this whole StreamYard technology, but we're going to give it a go. Now, to Chuck Klosterman. Chuck Klosterman is one of these guys that has sort of been foregrounded in some sense by Bill Simmons. He was an early participant in Bill Simmons's podcast, and he himself has that similar kind of style. He, instead of coming up by way of sports, came up by way of music criticism, and he's written some books, but they're kind of similar in vibe. He explores the intersection of pop culture and with broader social and economic and historical themes. Is one of his famous books is called The 90s, and it's pretty good. And Chuck, like Bill, forefronts his personality. And so I want to go ahead and play some of this video in the aftermath of uh, Donald Trump's victory over Kamala Harris. And I'm struck by how struck they are by what happened. And so here we go. And I'm going to play for a few minutes and we'll see how this goes.
We were going to bring up the election. Let's go.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about the election itself as much as I want to talk about this. I really feel that I do not know what's going on in the world now. And I don't mean because of the outcome of this election. I mean of my understanding of what the world was like and then the manifestation of the reality. It's like I was so like in 2016, it was like kind of a shocking outcome or whatever. This was less shocking. But yet it seemed as though I thought I had a pretty clear or a decent understanding of what the situation in the country was, and I was just totally wrong. It's like I think the country is we spent so much time, myself included, talking about how polarized the country is. I think in a lot of ways it's much less polarized than we realized, especially on a whole handful of issues. I suspected I just you were one of these people where I after the election, I texted people and I just said, like,
Yeah.
on a scale of 1 to 10, how surprised were you by this election? Not how you feel about it, just how surprised you were. And I found kind of a disturbing pattern. Okay. There are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, all the people I texted are, they're intelligent people who follow the news, but some people really follow the news. Some people voraciously follow it. They follow all the narratives. They kind of know anything you reference. They're like, oh, I already saw that story or whatever. Those people all gave answers like 8, 9, 9.5. It didn't matter what their political leaning was. Like, if they were really engaged with media, they were shocked by not just the outcome, but the fact that Trump won all the swing states, that he won the popular vote, all of these things.
So you could see here, he's shocked and he's distraught about how shocked he is. And he's, I think, correctly making the connection that those people that he texted the night in which Trump won the election against Kamala Harris, that those people in particular were most surprised, that those who followed it most closely were most surprised. And he says, I feel I do not understand what is going on. And I have to give Chuck props here for admitting that he does not know what is going on exactly. But and he's getting to the point where he's making, like, if you read, if you listened, if you watched to media going into the election, you were surprised. And so then the question is, well, if that's the case, aren't you, I don't know, a little bit concerned that you might be missing the boat?
The people I know, like a lot of them are like doctors and engineers and stuff, who follow the news but don't give a shit at all about the narrative. Like, when they look at the New York Times website, they do not look at the right side of the page. They look at the left side of the page. They all were like 1, 2, 3. Like, they weren't surprised at all. And I now sort of have the creeping suspicion that engagement with media distances us from reality.
Engagement with media distances us from reality, Chuck says. And notice that he's making a distinction between, I don't know, what we might call hard news with media. And so what I think he's talking about is the story, or the various stories, the various narratives that rise up. And I'm struck by this because I have to admit that I was, and this is not a brag, I was not surprised at all that Harris lost. I was surprised that maybe it was definitive. I genuinely thought it was kind of a toss-up, leading into the election. I admit on some level I was relieved because I'm just not a fan of Kamala Harris at all, and especially the way that she conducted her campaign uh, to be an almost contentless reality. But guys like Chuck and Bill don't get things wrong. In fact, they've made an entire career, a very impressive career for both of them. I mean, they have both done it in that kind of Frank Sinatra way. They have done it their way. Regrets, they may have a few, but then again, too few to mention, right? I mean, these guys look at them. I mean, they're in t-shirts. They are, at home. They have done extremely well for themselves. And so, but the very world in which they have sort of helped create and have been superstars in seems to have betrayed them both. And Chuck seems to recognize this a little bit more than Bill does.
That the more information I get, the more information I take in, the less I understand the world. And I don't know what to do about that, because that's a real issue if that is true. And that's how it feels for me now. My perception of what the world is being so shaped by these things that I'm not even close to what's actually happening. Do you feel this way? Like, how
Well, the betting markets would agree with you, because
I note that Bill sort of always defaults to the betting markets. In fact, he runs a sort of a regular bit with cousin Sal and whatnot on Sunday nights to guess the lines of the games and all those kinds of things. And so he does default to Vegas. But what he doesn't seem to remember about Vegas is that Vegas is trying to make money. And so he's going to make the point here that, well, Vegas had it at a much tighter race. Well, why do you think Vegas had it at a much tighter race? It's just so obvious to me.
the betting markets, I think like 5-6 days before the election, Kamala was almost even.
Yes.
And part of the thinking was the abortion, women are going to come out for this. People don't realize there's a lot of women even telling who they're married to or people in their lives that aren't coming out. So you'd hear that. There was an Iowa poll, right, that it was like, wow, she's doing great in Iowa. So when you're talking about how the media influences stuff, a lot of it is just the media are influencing narratives that, if you want to believe the narrative and you hear the narrative, you grab onto it, right?
So they want to believe the narrative, and so they grab onto it. But both of you just did that. So how do you make sense out of that, Bill?
You see the Iowa poll and you go, well, that's a great sign. She's doing really well in Iowa. So it almost feels like stuff was nudging people different ways. But to me, it was like, I thought when Elon went on Rogan, I felt like that was the most important part of the election, whether people want to admit it or not. Like Rogan coming out and saying that he was going to vote for Trump and that he was in on Trump, I think that influenced people. And I got
to tell you, I don't really think that's true. I don't really think that is what moved the needle. I think her not going on Rogan maybe was illustrative to certain people, but I don't think that Elon was a difference maker in that regard. And of course, but I do think, notice that he immediately invoked the Iowa poll, and the Iowa poll is such a hot mess, really a disturbing thing. And there've been various people who've been trying to sort of explain away like she's the best pollster, she's the gold standard, but in the aftermath, and certainly in the last couple of weeks, it's been clear that this was such a crazy outlier poll that you run that kind of poll, you report, quote unquote, on that kind of poll when you're trying to nudge things. Well, why are you trying to nudge things? Well, you're trying to create some sort of counter momentum, and we saw this throughout the vaulted 107 days, right? That first it was brat summer, and then it was joy, and so the whole convention was about joy and joy and joy, and nobody really kind of bought it, to be honest with you. So let's continue here with Chuck and Bill.
don't know if another media figure has that kind of power to shift votes. I'm not blaming Rogan one way or the other. I'm just saying there was real momentum that I think some people didn't want to overlook because they were like, oh, look at the Iowa poll.
But I mean, isn't that a little bit of reverse engineering though? Because
I think that's what every election is.
Well, it probably is. Okay, but if that's true, then we have a bunch of things to rethink. Because
yeah, we do have a bunch of things to rethink, as Chuck is pointing out here. It's like this is a real problem, because people kind of want to believe a narrative. And you two have been part of that narrative formation, and you became victims to sort of your own mythology here.
In a sense, it kind of looked like, well, Oprah, Taylor Swift, all these people, they endorsed Harris. Nobody cared. Didn't seem to have any influence. But now we're like, well,
celebrities had no impact at all.
But you just said that you think that him going on Rogan was one of the biggest things. Like Rogan's endorsement mattered. It only because it worked out that way. I don't think any of these endorsements mattered. I now think that basically any Republican candidate would have won this election. I think that it, if Nikki Haley would have ran, I think she would have won probably by a very similar margin. I think that there is the sense now that there's all this news going around kind of shifting these stories. Like you say, these stories like, oh, there's, people are canvassing and
is this news going on that's sort of shifting okay, he's sort of being fast and loose with news versus media. So now news is kind of like a narrative formation thing. It's a little bit unclear. But notice that Bill seems to want to have it both ways. Like, well, we always do this. Like, this is how it always works. I'm not so sure.
And women are closing the door saying, I'm secretly voting for Harris. I'm not telling my husband. Now it kind of looks like maybe the opposite of this was the case, that people were saying they were going to go vote for Harris because they didn't want to be maybe judged or have an issue with their friends who they thought were. Like, it was actually, they were saying the opposite of what this supposed sort of trend, because hours before the election, you could go on social media and there were people saying things like, what if I told you this isn't going to be close at all? Thinking that it was going to be a blowout in the other.
And this is really true. I mean, that's exactly what was happening. If you were on Twitter or YouTube or heck TV, even on the day of the election, all of these sort of the pro Harris crowd, and of course their enablers on all the major platforms are saying this is, Harris is going to like lock this up. And so it's like, what kind of weird thing is going on here?
Other direction. So no one really had any sense of these things. I mean, I think that the in this situation, it kind of felt
there's one thing. There's one thing on the Rogan point that I think people didn't want to see as it was happening, which was that there was young men, basically 18 to 35, that were shifting a certain direction in all these different ways. And the Rogan thing was symbolic to it. It just felt like that was a demographic that I think the Democrats were probably counting on that wasn't there in the way they thought. And there were just a lot of people ready for a change. I was thinking it's the opposite of what happened like when we were both in college in 92, right? Mm-hmm. And it felt like there was this Republican stranglehold on the country. It was 12 straight years of a Republican president. And Clinton kind of showed up, a year.
Now, this is particularly rich, of course, because Bill is forgetting that Chuck wrote the book on the 90s, and there's a major sort of chapter on the election and Perot and all of that. And so it's a little funny to hear him opine here, but I want to kind of skip over that and get back to 33. Here we go. Here we go.
Because there were three candidates. I mean, that was kind of a strange one. I mean, this is a strange one too. But like, even the way we're talking about this, you said like, these young men who are sort of moving in a different direction. That was immediately the day after the election, 2 days after. It was sort of like, why have these young men become radicalized? And then I was like, well, or is it the opposite? Is it that all of culture has moved away from young men and they have remained static? That they have actually changed the least? Because, they're like, I mean, they're sort of, they know 55% of the electorate is women. 60% of people in college now are women. So if you're a college age student and you're a guy in a class and like you see someone wearing a t-shirt that says the future is female, maybe you conclude, I guess it is. Seems that way to me too. And they maybe just did not, they were like, we're just going to sort of check out in a sense, not pay attention, but just we're not involved with the way culture is changing, and everything else in culture changed sort of to, leaving them behind maybe to some degree. And they were kind of like, well, I'll vote for Trump because he doesn't care either, or whatever, however they thought. I don't want to say, I don't here again, I feel very reluctant to even give this opinion because I feel less confident about any of these things now. Like I really have a sense that that what is really happening in people's lives is the chasm between that and the way American life is projected through mass media now is so vast that the projection is actually giving us confusion over the reality.
That is such a good point. And I wonder if Chuck will have the strength of his own hunch at this point to do some serious soul searching over how much even those who are part of making the narratives, how much you can start to kind of fall in love with your own creations. And will Chuck do some work here? I don't know about Bill. I think Bill's a little bit less circumspect. I think he has kind of less intellectual depth than somebody like Chuck Klosterman. Chuck is less confident, and I think he needs to be less confident. And will this change the way that he sort of sees the world, and the way that he sees the world, and how it is constructed, the world, right? How it is constructed by the media that we indulge, the media that we engorge upon, the media that shapes our sort of transjective shared reality. I also find it remarkable that we are, sort of deep into this conversation, and there's zero sort of recognition of Harris's own faults as a candidate. But Bill will bring up the 107 days and go, oh, like how could it be? And then Chuck brings up the lack of sincerity. Again, Chuck really is a little bit more on point here. So let's go here. One last point here. Go to 39. All right. I'll hit my mute button.
Yeah, we shouldn't have done this thing. I don't know why we were saying that. Like they almost immediately admitted that they regretted this. And what is probably true is that people sensed that lack of sincerity during the campaign. It's like,
Right.
they're like, you don't really believe that. Like, you don't really believe these things you're saying, or you're afraid to talk about these things in public. So you're just going to say nothing. And that,
Well, but wait a second.
and I think that a lot of people got a sense of that, but like someone like me who's trying to follow this stuff so closely and sort of know the information, like I'm the one who ends up being the idiot. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one, being, the idiot. And then Bill is going to right here, he's going to sort of do a both sides. I'll just run it real quick. Why not?
Yeah, but even in the moment, like their whole strategy with Kamala was they were basically treating her like she was a game manager quarterback in football, right? Like just try to get us some first downs. Don't say too much. Let's try to protect certain things with you. Like even the fact that she was doing like some carefully planned podcasts or show appearances, right? Where it's Trump, who's insane, who'd just be like, I'll do anything. I'll talk. for 4 hours on whatever platform. I don't care. And she never found that middle ground. I still never felt like I had, even after those 3.5 months, I never felt like I had a complete sense of everything she stood for and what her message was. And I think if the Democrats probably learned anything from the last 2 years, it's like people still want to be inspired. Like they still want to feel like this person resonates with me in these ways because.
But that was the attempt, though. I mean, up into the last, getting down close to the election, it was sort of like the Republicans have this cynical view, this nihilistic view that America's getting worse. We don't.
I should have said. Notice it's the Republicans that are considered the ones who are the cynical ones, and it's I just want to say, please, like, just look in the mirror just for a second. Like the cynicism of this 107-day campaign is really, really, truly stunning.
Think that. We think that, we're, and it didn't work. It didn't
But
happen.
that's what everybody says during every election. It's like, are you better off 4 years now than you were 4 years ago? That's like, we've been watching that for 30 plus years with both sides, right? That's what, when you're the other side, you always try to make it seem like the other side, everybody's worse off. That's the dialogue of an election.
I mean, like,
and sometimes it's bullshit. Sometimes it's real.
Well, is it ever real? Is it really?
Is it ever real? I mean, that's a real question, right? I mean, this is a good question. Bill's just not having anything of it.
Maybe it's not.
What does it's like you learn about the Chiefs, for example, because if the Chiefs go to the playoffs and lose immediately. If they lose immediately, then, of course, the response will be like, well, they played all these close games during the year against relatively bad teams, and they barely squeaked it out over and over again. They can't do it forever. If they win, of course, then those same wins validate why they won. It was like they were always ready to just, flip the switch and turn it on. So anything in the past can prove anything, right? Like all these things that people have been saying about Harris, if she had won, would still be part of the discourse. It would just be, see, it was right. It was true. So it's like it because all this discourse is just I hate to say it, but it is like it is clearly just made up.
And there it is, right? This discourse is just made up, right? And there's a real truth to this, right? And this is a disturbing truth, right? That there's a sort of a discourse, there's the discourse layer, and then there's sort of the terrain layer, and map layer, terrain layer, and it's as if is our map wrong? Chuck is asking, and Bill's like, "Oh, come on, it's always like this," and it's like Chuck's like not buying it, because I think even though Chuck has this sort of slacker, like, oh, like whatever sort of affect, like I think he's genuinely disturbed by the disconnect between the discourse layer and the layer of actually what is going on. And Bill, again, does not have any time for.
And what drives me crazy is there's a bunch of people listening to this podcast right now who are hearing me say this, and they're saying, like, of course, how did you not know this? We all know this, and like I am,
right.
But they're justified in saying that. It's like I just
Wait, here's the other
fucking
problem,
know
though.
what's going on. I don't know what's happening. Like, I don't know what's happening in the world. And I have to accept it. I have to accept that I have no idea what's happening, because I don't. Like, it's not, and I'm not saying this from this position of outrage. I'm saying this from a position of sort of like, I guess in some ways, vulnerability, like just my recognition that I am now receiving my understanding about life through external sources that are not giving me a real depiction of what's happening.
And for me, this is why, this is why it matters. This is why bringing these two guys on to sort of talk about the election, and especially Chuck Klosterman's truly just befuddled and having, I think, a crisis of faith, I think he would call it, if he could recognize that what he has is a faith in the sense-making institutions. Now, this is, of course, part of a much larger catastrophe, a much larger problem. And so I think, I'm not holding my breath here, certainly not holding my breath for Bill Simmons. Is he sort of trying to play the why is anybody surprised or both sides or like they're all doing this, right? And he's going to sort of tack back to sports. And look, we could have a whole thing about how narratives are created around sports and legends and mythologies. But what I want them to do is sort of take those same tools that I've learned from them, right? I want to take those same tools and then apply it to sort of what's going on here in the podcast. This is something that we are going to have to be doing. Now, we can have this conversation about politics. We can have this conversation about cultural matters. I think we're going to really have to have this conversation about the whole UAP drone phenomena that's going on, but it's the same kind of thing. Just notice, right? You have to be open enough to sort of take in all this information, but you have to be discerning enough to understand that the narrative layer, this discourse layer, and the level of terrain are being, we like to think that it's never a perfect overlay, but we'd like to think that these things are a little closer to being, sort of accurate, right? But this disambiguation between the discourse and the terrain, between the map and what's on the ground reality is sort of coming apart. And it is so fascinating for me to watch these two guys who are considered the cool guys. And I like them, right? They're considered the cool guys, and yet they can't quite make sense out of it. So anyway, I don't want to waste any more of your time today. If you have anything to say, please drop it in the comment. I'll put the link to the show in the comment. And thank you for coming around. Until next time, look for the underneath.